Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Audra Charles never intended for the truth to surface this way, but in Genoa City, secrets have a way of clawing their way out of the shadows, especially when blood, betrayal, and buried guilt are involved, and as the town reels from the aftermath of Noah Newman's devastating accident, a horrifying realization begins to take shape. One that will shatter families, rewrite loyalties, and expose Audra not merely as a woman with ambition, but as the silent architect behind a chain of events that nearly cost Noah his life because what no one knew, what no one even suspected, was that the night Noah's car veered off the road wasn't a tragic accident born of bad weather or bad luck, but a carefully engineered moment set into motion weeks earlier by Audra herself, who had been watching Noah spiral emotionally, professionally, and psychologically, seeing in his vulnerability both a threat and an opportunity. And while the world saw a woman trying to survive in the ruthless Newman orbit, Audra was quietly playing a far more dangerous game, one that began the moment she realized Noah was standing between her and everything she wanted, because Noah wasn't just Kyle's brother or Nikki's grandson. He was a moral anchor, a man who refused to bend, a witness to truths Audra couldn't afford to have exposed, especially after he started asking questions about a series of financial anomalies tied to her past dealings, anomalies that pointed to manipulation, coercion, and a long-buried connection to forces darker than anyone imagined. And as Noah pushed closer to uncovering her involvement in a covert scheme involving shell companies, stolen tech assets, and backdoor deals that even Victor Newman hadn't fully traced, Audra knew she had to act. Not violently, not directly, but strategically, because Audra doesn't destroy with her hands, she destroys with timing, influence, and misdirection, and so she began laying the groundwork, subtly nudging Noah toward emotional instability. By exploiting his lingering pain over Allie, his strained relationship with Nick, and his internal struggle to prove himself outside the Newman legacy, whispering doubts into the right ears, arranging coincidental confrontations, ensuring that Noah felt isolated, pressured, and desperate enough to take risks he normally wouldn't. And the night of the accident, Audra knew exactly where Noah would be, exactly what he'd be thinking, and exactly how fragile he'd be, because she had orchestrated the argument that sent him storming out. She had manipulated the information that made him believe his career was about to collapse. Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. In the dim, cavernous silence of the Newman Ranch living room, where shadows stretched like ghosts across the walls and the crackling fireplace sounded more like a countdown than comfort, Nikki Newman stood frozen with a small black USB drive clenched in her trembling hand. Her breath shallow, her heart pounding so violently it felt as though it might betray her before she could betray the man she once loved more than life itself, because this tiny device, so insignificant in appearance, had detonated everything she believed about Victor Newman, the titan she married, divorced, defended, and nearly destroyed herself for. And as she stared across the room at him, seated calmly in his leather chair with that infuriatingly unreadable expression, Nikki realized with bone-chilling clarity that this USB wasn't just data. It was a confession, a graveyard of secrets, a digital executioner that had been hiding in plain sight for decades, and it had come to her through a chain of blood, betrayal, and silence that began months earlier when an anonymous envelope arrived at the athletic club addressed simply to Mrs. Newman, containing nothing but the drive and a handwritten note that read, "If you want the truth about Victor, press play." And at first Nikki had laughed it off, assuming it was another desperate attempt by one of Victor's many enemies to fracture their already fragile détente. But something about the weight of the envelope, the shaky penmanship, the unmistakable sense of fear embedded in every letter, compelled her to wait until she was alone, until the club emptied, until even the ghosts of Genoa City seemed to hold their breath. And when she inserted the USB into her laptop, she expected blackmail, financial corruption, maybe an affair or two, but instead she found folders, meticulously organized, time-stamped, and labeled with names she recognized all too well: Adam, Ashlyn, JT, Diane, Chavez, Phoenix. And with each click her world cracked wider. revealing
truth has
encrypted
weight,
audio
and it
files of
began
Victor
pressing
ordering
down hardest
surveillance,
when Noah
video
confronted
footage
Audra
of bribes
privately.
exchanged in
No
underground
accusations,
parking
no
garages,
shouting, just a
scanned
quiet,
contracts signed
devastating
under
question
duress,
that sliced
hospital
through her
records
defenses.
altered to erase
Why did you want
paternity,
me out of the
and
way?
most damning of
And
all,
in that
a series of
moment,
voice
Audra
recordings,
saw the damage
Victor's
she had caused
unmistakable
not just to
voice,
Noah,
cold,
but to herself,
calculated, and
because
devoid
what
of the
began
moral
as
justifications
self-preservation
he
had
usually
turned into
cloaked
something
himself in,
monstrous,
discussing
something
how far someone
irreversible.
would need to
And
be
though she denied
removed
everything,
if they
the
threatened
fear
the
in her
Newman
eyes told the
empire,
real story,
and Nikki felt
because Audra
herself
knows when a game
growing
is
nauseous
lost,
as she
and
listened
as
to
the
him
final
casually
piece of
reference
evidence
people
surfaced,
not as lives
a
but as
digital trail
liabilities,
linking her directly
including
to
a
the
recording
tampering
dated
order.
years
The
earlier where he
shockwaves through
spoke of
Genoa
Nikki
City was
herself,
seismic.
saying that
With
keeping
Nick
her
furious,
dependent keeps her
Victoria
loyal.
horrified,
Words
Hal
that sliced
shattered,
through her like
and
glass,
Victor more intrigued
forcing
than
her to
outraged,
confront the
because he
horrifying
recognized
possibility
in
that
Audra
even
a
her
reflection
battles
of
with
his own
addiction had
darkest
been
instincts.
weaponized by the
And
man
when
she
Audra
trusted
was
to
finally
save her.
exposed
And
as
as
the
the files
mastermind behind
continued,
Noah's accident,
Nikki discovered
her carefully
evidence tying
constructed
Victor to
identity
crimes that
collapsed,
had
revealing
never
a woman
officially
driven
been
by
solved,
ambition so fierce it
accidents that
eclipsed her
weren't
humanity.
accidents,
And as she
suicides that
stood
weren't
alone,
suicides,
facing the
financial
consequences
collapses that
of her
led to ruined
actions,
families,
Audra didn't
all
beg,
orchestrated
didn't
through
cry,
layers of
didn't
shell companies,
apologize, because
proxies,
even
and loyal
stripped of
soldiers
power,
who had
she
long since
refused to
vanished or
appear
been
weak.
silenced,
But the
and she
cost
realized
was
the sender wasn't trying to
undeniable
destroy
relationships
Victor with
destroyed,
exposure,
trust
but was instead
obliterated,
passing the
and a
burden of
legacy
truth
forever
to the one
stained,
person who could
while
destroy
Noah,
him
scarred but
emotionally,
stronger,
morally, and
emerged not
permanently.
just as a survivor,
Because Nikki wasn't
but as
just
the
his
living
ex,
proof that Audra's
wife,
greatest
she was his
miscalculation
conscience,
wasn't
the
the
only
accident
person whose
itself,
judgment he
but
still feared.
underestimating the
And as
truth's
days
ability
passed,
to
Nikki
rise,
became a
because
woman
in Genoa
haunted,
City,
unable to
no
sleep,
secret
drink,
stays
or
buried
breathe
forever,
without hearing
and
Victor's
Audra
voice
Charles has
echoing
just
through those
learned the most
recordings,
brutal lesson of
watching
all.
him smile at her
Masterminds
across
may
dinner
pull the
tables
strings,
while
but
knowing he had
eventually,
destroyed
they're
lives
forced
without
to face the
hesitation.
wreckage.
And when
They
she
leave
confronted Jack
behind.
Abbott in secret,
Audra's exposure
showing
as
him
the
only a
mastermind
fraction of
behind
what she'd
Noah's
found,
accident
even
sent
Jack,
shockwaves not
hardened
only
by
through the
decades
Newman
of war
family,
with
but across
Victor,
the entire
was
landscape
shaken
of
into
Genoa
silence,
City,
warning her that
reverberating through
releasing
every
this
office,
information would bring
penthouse, and
chaos
back
not
alley
only
where
to
whispered
Victor but
rumors
to their
thrive,
children,
because
to
the
Newman
city thrives on
Enterprises,
secrets,
to Genoa
and when
City
one of its
itself,
most dangerous
because
players
Victor's
is
empire
revealed,
was
the
intertwined with
ripples cannot be
everything,
contained.
and Nikki found
And as
herself
Audra
trapped
walked through the
between
halls of
justice and
Newman
collateral
Enterprises,
damage,
each
between
gaze
truth
from
and blood,
colleagues and rivals
until the
alike
final
was a
file
dagger,
revealed itself.
piercing the
A
carefully
hidden folder
constructed
titled
veneer of
simply Nikki,
professionalism
containing
she
a
had
single
maintained for
video
years.
recorded years
And in
earlier,
those glances were
where
questions
Victor
she could
admitted
not
to
answer,
orchestrating events
suspicion
that
she
pushed
could
her
not quell,
toward
and judgment
relapse,
she could not
manipulating
escape.
circumstances
And even
so
though
she would
moved
lean
with
on
the
him,
precision of a
depend
chess
on him,
master,
stay tethered to him
calculating every
emotionally
word,
when she
every
was
smile,
drifting
every
away.
gesture,
And as Nikki
she knew
watched
that every
herself
step she
unravel
took
on
was
screen
shadowed
while
by the
Victor narrated it
inevitability
like a
of
chess match he
confrontation,
had won,
because Noah,
something inside her
recovering
snapped.
physically but
The love she
sharpening
still
mentally,
carried collapsing
had
under the
begun,
weight of unforgivable
assembling his own
truth.
evidence,
And that was the
connecting
moment she
every
decided
subtle
Victor had to
manipulation,
face her,
every
not
discreet
as a king
whisper,
or a
every
husband or a myth,
strategically placed
but as a man
misdirection back
stripped
to
bare
her.
by his
And
own
it
words.
terrified
And
Audra
now,
in a way nothing else
here they
had,
were, the
because for the
USB
first
sitting on
time,
the table
she
between them
understood
like
that
a
in
loaded
Genoa
weapon.
City,
Nikki
power is
holding an
only as
actual
strong as
gun in her
perception,
other hand,
and Noah's
not out of
perception of betrayal
premeditation
was
but
a
out of
weapon more
necessity,
lethal than
because
anything she had
confronting
ever
Victor
engineered.
Newman without
And as
leverage
she
was
retreated
suicide.
into the
And when
solitude of her
Victor finally
penthouse
spoke,
apartment,
his voice
the walls
calm but
seemed to
edged with
close
warning,
in, the
asking her why
silent
she looked at him like a
accusations she could
stranger.
not deny.
Nikki pressed the
And yet,
remote and
even
filled
as
the
the net
room
of
with his own
exposure
voice
tightened,
confessing to
Audra's
crimes
mind
he had
raced,
never imagined Nikki
formulating
would hear.
contingencies,
And for the
calculating
first
allies and
time in his
reconfiguring
life, Victor
strategies,
Newman was
because
speechless,
surrender was
his
never an
mask
option,
cracking as Nikki
and Audra
listed
never
every
played by
betrayal,
conventional
every
rules.
manipulation,
And as she
every
plotted,
life he'd
she
crushed,
realized
her
that to
voice
maintain
breaking
her
not with
empire
fear
and
but with
survive the
grief.
fallout,
And when
she
Victor
would need
tried
to
to justify
manipulate not
himself,
just individuals,
claiming
but
it
the
was all
very
for
systems
family,
that
for
controlled
survival, for
information,
love, Nikki
influence,
raised
and
the gun,
power,
tears
and so
streaming
she
down her face as she
began
told him
subtly
love
pulling
does not
strings
destroy
behind
the
the
soul of
scenes,
the woman you
reaching
claim to
out to
protect.
contacts
And
whose
for one
loyalty was
suspended moment,
transactional,
time itself
arranging
seemed to
meetings under
fracture.
false
The
pretenses,
sound of
forging
Nikki's ragged
alliances with
breathing
those
louder
equally
than the
ambitious,
fire,
and
louder than
deploying
Victor's
psychological
racing thoughts,
tactics designed
louder
to
than
sow doubt,
decades of
fear,
power
and
and fear.
discord.
and Victor, staring down the barrel of the gun, finally understood that this was not about exposure or prison or death but about judgment, because Nikki wasn't deciding whether to shoot him, she was deciding whether the man before her deserved to keep existing as Victor Newman, or whether the truth contained in that USB would erase him completely. And as sirens echoed, faintly in the distance, summoned not by Nikki but by a failsafe embedded in the USB that would auto-release its contents to authorities if it wasn't reinserted within the hour, Victor reached out not as a tyrant but as a broken man, whispering her name, and Nikki, lowering the gun but not the truth, told him the empire he built on fear would now stand on accountability, because she would not kill him, but she would let the truth do something far more devastating, expose him to the world without her protection, without her silence, without her love. And as Nikki walked out of the ranch with the USB still in her possession, leaving Victor alone with the wreckage of his own making, Genoa City stood on the brink of a reckoning that would change every life tied to the Newman name forever. In the aftermath of Nikki Newman's departure from the ranch, the silence she left behind was not empty but suffocating. pressing in on Victor Newman like a living thing as he remained seated long after the door closed, staring at the space where she had stood with the gun lowered but the truth raised higher than any weapon he had ever faced. And for the first time in his life, Victor did not reach for a phone, did not bark orders, did not summon lawyers or fixers or loyal soldiers, because every instinct he possessed told him that nothing, no amount of money, intimidation, or manipulation could undo what had just happened, since the real damage was not the USB itself but the certainty in Nikki's eyes that she finally saw him clearly, and that realization gnawed at him as memories surfaced unbidden, memories of moments he had always reframed as necessary sacrifices but now appeared disturbingly different when viewed through the lens of exposure, because Victor knew that Nikki was not a woman who bluffed when it came to moral lines, and if she had walked away without destroying him outright, it was not mercy but resolve, the resolve to let the truth take its slow, devastating course. And as Victor rose and poured himself a drink with an unsteady hand, the ranch felt smaller, almost claustrophobic, as if the walls themselves were listening, recording, cataloging his sins just like that cursed USB. While across town Nikki drove aimlessly through Genoa City, tears blurring the lights as decades of love, rage, regret, and relief crashed over her in waves, because leaving Victor alive but unprotected felt simultaneously like liberation and mourning, as though she had finally buried the man she loved while the man he truly was still walked the earth, and with every mile she put between herself and the ranch, Nikki replayed the moment Victor's composure cracked, knowing that she had inflicted a wound no enemy ever had, and yet the weight of what she now carried, the power to expose Victor Newman to the world, felt heavier than any gun, heavier than any addiction she had ever battled, because she understood better than anyone that Victor's fall would not be isolated, that it would tear through their children, their grandchildren, and the fragile ecosystem of Genoa City itself. And when Nikki finally pulled over near Chancellor Park, clutching the USB like a talisman and a curse, she allowed herself to break down completely, sobbing not just for herself but for the woman she had been when she believed love could redeem a man who never truly wanted redemption, only control. And as dawn approached, Nikki made her decision not to run or hide but to prepare, because Victor would not sit idle forever, and even stripped of her silence he was still Victor Newman, a man whose survival instinct was unmatched. And sure enough, by morning Victor had begun moving pieces on the board, summoning Michael Baldwin not with his usual thunderous authority but with a quiet urgency that unsettled even his most loyal attorney, as Victor laid out only fragments of the situation, carefully omitting Nikki's role while emphasizing the existence of potentially catastrophic evidence. And Michael, seasoned as he was, immediately recognized the danger, warning Victor that any attempt to suppress or destroy the material could trigger legal consequences far worse than exposure, especially if Nikki had already established safeguards, which Victor neither confirmed nor denied. His silence speaking volumes as he ordered Michael to find out who created the USB, who had access to it, and how many copies might exist, because if Victor could not control the truth, he would at least attempt to contain it, while elsewhere Jack Abbott watched developments with wary anticipation after Nikki contacted him again, this time not with hesitation but with grim clarity, revealing the full scope of what she possessed. And Jack, torn between his lifelong desire to see Victor finally face justice and his concern for the collateral damage such exposure would cause, urged Nikki to proceed carefully, reminding her that once the truth was released it could not be recalled, and Nikki, exhausted but resolute, told Jack she was done protecting Victor from himself, because every day of silence had been another day of complicity, and as word began to ripple through Genoa City's inner circles that something seismic was coming, alliances shifted subtly, eyes narrowed and long buried, grudges stirred, with Phyllis Summer sensing opportunity in chaos, Ashley Abbott fearing corporate fallout, and Adam Newman feeling an inexplicable dread that whatever was about to surface would finally explain the lifelong sense that his pain had always been part of a larger design. And when Nikki finally confronted Victoria and Nick, the conversation shattered what remained of the illusion that their father's sins were exaggerated by enemies, because Nikki showed them select pieces of the evidence, not enough to overwhelm but enough to devastate, and as Victoria struggled to reconcile the ruthless businessman she admired with the manipulative architect revealed by the recordings, Nick's anger ignited instantly, demanding to know how long Nikki had known and why she hadn't acted sooner, and Nikki, voice breaking, confessed that love had blinded her, that fear had silenced her, and that she would live with that guilt forever. But she would not let it continue, and the siblings, united not in loyalty to their father but in shock and betrayal, faced an impossible choice: stand by Victor and become complicit, or stand by the truth and risk destroying the family name forever. And as the days passed, Victor began to feel the walls closing in. Not from law enforcement or the media but from his own blood. As calls went unanswered, meetings were postponed, and the familiar deference he commanded gave way to wary distance. And in rare moments of solitude Victor allowed himself to feel something dangerously close to regret. Not for the crimes themselves, which he still rationalized as survival, but for the one line he had crossed that could never be justified, turning Nikki's vulnerability into leverage. And when he finally confronted her again, tracking her down to a quiet room at the athletic club where their history had unfolded so many times before, Victor did not threaten or plead but simply asked if there was any way back from this. And Nikki, meeting his gaze with heartbreaking calm, told him that forgiveness was possible but silence was not, that accountability was the price of any future. And Victor, realizing that the woman who once saved him now stood as the gatekeeper to his reckoning, felt something he had spent a lifetime avoiding, the terror of being truly powerless. And as Nikki walked away once more, leaving Victor alone with the consequences of his choices, Genoa City braced itself for the fallout, because the USB that broke Nikki had not just exposed Victor's darkest crimes. It had ignited a chain reaction that would force every character to confront the uncomfortable truth that power without conscience eventually consumes everything it touches, and the storm was only just beginning. Tragedy. As the storm Nikki had unleashed continued to gather force, Genoa City entered a strange, electric limbo where nothing had officially changed yet everything felt irrevocably altered, because rumors, never specific but always ominous, began to circulate through boardrooms, hospital corridors, and society galas, whispers that Victor Newman's armor had finally cracked, that the man who had outmaneuvered enemies for decades was now vulnerable in a way no hostile takeover or prison sentence had ever made him, and at the center of that storm stood Nikki, exhausted but unyielding, aware that every step she took was now being watched, weighed, and interpreted, yet refusing to retreat into the shadows again, because she understood that this moment demanded visibility, courage, and endurance. And when the media first began sniffing around, calls from reporters hinting they had received anonymous tips about forthcoming revelations tied to Newman Enterprises, Nikki recognized Victor's old world, colliding violently with a new one where secrets did not stay buried. And while Victor attempted to project business as usual, making public appearances with his trademark steel-eyed confidence, those closest to him could see the cracks forming beneath the surface, his temper flaring unpredictably, his patience wearing thin, because every smile he offered to the cameras was haunted by the knowledge that somewhere, in a location he could not control, the truth existed in a form that could destroy him with a single click. And as Michael Baldwin scrambled behind the scenes to erect legal firewalls, filing preemptive motions and quietly contacting prosecutors to gauge exposure without implicating his client further, even he began to sense that this crisis was different, because it wasn't driven by ambition or revenge but by moral reckoning, the most dangerous adversary Victor Newman had ever faced. And as Adam watched his father unravel, fragments of his own tortured past began to align into a horrifying pattern. Moments when Victor had pushed him away only to pull him back, sabotaged relationships, manipulated outcomes, and now Adam couldn't shake the suspicion that his pain had never been collateral damage but intentional design. And when Adam confronted Nikki privately, demanding the full truth rather than curated fragments, Nikki hesitated only briefly before handing him a separate drive, smaller, redacted, but devastating, containing files that chronicled Victor's orchestration of events in Adam's life with chilling precision. And as Adam absorbed the evidence, rage and grief collided inside him, because the father he had alternately worshipped and despised was suddenly revealed as the architect of his suffering, and Adam's vow to expose Victor became deeply personal, transforming him from conflicted son into relentless adversary, while Victoria, torn between loyalty and leadership, faced mounting pressure within Newman Enterprises as shareholders began asking questions, sensing instability at the top, and when Victoria proposed internal audits and transparency initiatives to stabilize the company, Victor rejected them outright, seeing them as admissions of guilt, further widening the rift between father and daughter. and Nick, increasingly vocal in his condemnation, publicly distanced himself from Victor, resigning from the board and igniting speculation that the Newman family itself was fracturing, and through it all Nikki became both symbol and scapegoat, praised quietly by some for her courage while condemned by others for betraying Victor, accusations that stung but did not deter her, because she knew that truth often demanded the sacrifice of reputation, and as she worked closely with legal counsel to prepare for the inevitable release of the USB's contents, Nikki insisted on one condition that stunned everyone involved. The evidence would be released in full, without spin, without selective leaks, because she refused to let Victor claim he was being targeted unfairly, believing that only total transparency could prevent him from rewriting the narrative as he always had. And as the release date approached, tension mounted to near unbearable levels, culminating in a disastrous Newman Enterprises gala intended to project unity and strength, where Victor, Nikki, and their children found themselves under the same roof for the first time since the ranch confrontation, and the atmosphere crackled with unspoken accusations and unresolved pain. And when Victor attempted to corner Nikki, accusing her of destroying their family, Nikki calmly reminded him that the family had been damaged long before the USB ever existed, by his choices, his secrets, and his belief that power justified anything. And when Victor warned her that exposure would ruin lives beyond his own, Nikki replied that secrecy already had. And as the clock struck midnight and guests toasted to legacy and longevity, Nikki slipped away to a secure location, where with trembling but resolute hands she initiated the release protocol, triggering the simultaneous distribution of the files to law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and multiple media outlets, ensuring that no single entity could suppress the truth. And as the first headlines began to break, cryptic at first, then explosive, Victor felt the full weight of consequence crash down upon him. As investigators arrived, warrants were issued, and his carefully constructed empire began to crumble under the scrutiny it had evaded for decades. And in the days that followed, Genoa City transformed into a battlefield of narratives, with Victor's defenders framing him as a ruthless but necessary force, while victims emerged from the shadows, emboldened by the evidence, sharing stories of intimidation, coercion, and lives irreparably altered by his actions. And Nikki watched from a distance as the man she loved became a symbol of unchecked power finally held accountable, experiencing moments of doubt and grief but never regret, because she knew that this reckoning, painful as it was, offered something Genoa City had long been denied, truth. And when Victor was finally arrested, not in handcuffs paraded before cameras but quietly, with dignity afforded by his status, Nikki felt no triumph, only a solemn sense of closure, because the gun she once raised had been replaced by something far more powerful, the refusal to remain silent. And as Victor was led away, he locked eyes with Nikki one last time, not with anger but with understanding, realizing too late that the woman he tried to control had become the instrument of his undoing. And as Genoa City adjusted to life without Victor Newman at its helm, alliances reshaped, wounds reopened, and futures reimagined, Nikki began the slow, difficult process of reclaiming her own identity beyond wife, protector, and accomplice, knowing that while the USB had broken her, it had also freed her, and that the legacy of this moment would ripple through generations, serving as a warning that even the most powerful men are not immune to the consequences of their darkest truths when finally brought into light. Is never powerless. And as she prepared for the next chapter, the city held its collective breath, knowing that whatever came next would be more shocking, more devastating, and more unforgettable than anything they had witnessed before, because in the young and the restless, the drama never sleeps. The stakes are never lower than life itself, and the secrets that define Genoa City are only as permanent as the next revelation. And Audra Charles, whether hero, villain, or tragic anti-hero, was poised at the epicenter of it all. Her story far from over, her impact indelible, and her next move capable of changing the course of the city forever.